In the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered, the celebrations were done, the champagne was gone, and now the real problem began. Two armies that had spent 4 years fighting toward each other were suddenly standing face to face in the middle of a destroyed continent, and nobody was quite sure what happened next. The Americans and the Soviets were supposed to be allies. On paper, they were. But on the ground, the relationship was much more complicated and much more tense than the official photographs suggested. In the middle of all of this stood George Patton, a man who never pretended to feel something he didn't. He didn't trust the Soviets. He didn't like them. And he thought America had stopped advancing at exactly the wrong moment. What he said to Marshal Zhukov after a direct insult would change his fate forever. By July 1945, the smoke over Berlin had cleared, but a toxic fog of suspicion was rising. In the Soviet occupation zone, the Red Army wasn't just patrolling, they were dismantling the industrial heart of Europe. Patton watched from his headquarters as entire factories were ripped from the ground and shipped east on railcars. He saw NKVD trophy brigades clearing out everything from livestock to priceless art. To the world, it was the spoils of war. To Patton, it was a new occupation by a power that had no intention of leaving. He was a master of history, and he knew that a conqueror who doesn't stop never intends to. He began sending frantic, high-priority cables to Washington, bypassing official channels when he could. He warned General Eisenhower that the Soviet T-34 tanks weren't being serviced for a parade. They were being fueled and maintained for a potential drive to the English Channel. He famously asked his superiors, "Why are we demobilizing our most battle-hardened divisions while Stalin is moving fresh, elite Siberian corps into the center of Germany?" To the politicians in Washington, Patton was an old war dog who couldn't stop barking. They wanted a grand alliance. They wanted peace at any price. But Patton saw what they refused to admit, that by stopping at the Elbe River, the United States had handed half of the continent to a dictator, just as ruthless as the one they had just buried. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was a collision of two worldviews that could only end in one way, with one side blinking first. The breaking point arrived on a humid August evening in Bavaria. A massive formal banquet was organized to celebrate the great victory. It was a spectacle designed to show the world that the Big Three were still united, but the atmosphere inside the hall was anything but friendly. On one side of the long mahogany tables sat the American brass, men like Patton, in their clean, pressed khakis and polished boots. On the other side sat the Soviet High Command. Their tunics were heavy, literally covered in layers of gold stars and red enamel medals that clinked every time they moved. The air in the room was a thick mixture of expensive cigars and the sharp, medicinal smell of Russian vodka. George Patton sat there, his ivory-handled revolvers visible at his hips, looking like a caged tiger. He hated the forced smiles and the empty diplomatic toasts, and directly across from him sat Marshal Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov was the iron fist of the Soviet Union. He was a man who had sacrificed millions of lives to take Berlin and was the only person who could look Joseph Stalin in the eye without fear. He viewed the Americans with a cold mixture of amusement and deep contempt. To him, they were amateurs who had arrived late to a party that the Red Army had already won. Before we get to the exact words that sent the room into a deathly silence, if you appreciate this level of deep historical investigation, take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. It's the only way we can keep Mike's investigations into the hidden truth of the war alive. The explosion happened after the 5th round of vodka. The room was loud, filled with the boisterous laughter of men who had survived hell. But then, Zhukov stood up. He didn't just stand. He commanded the space. The room went silent instantly. Every glass was lowered. Every fork stopped mid-air. Zhukov didn't address the crowd. He locked his gaze directly onto Patton. Through his personal translator, his voice came out deep, like heavy gravel grinding together. He made a remark that was clearly designed to be a psychological strike. He suggested that Patton's legendary Third Army had essentially chased shadows through France and Germany. He implied that the Americans only moved so fast because the real German army, the hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, had already been decimated by Soviet steel months before. He looked at Patton's decorated chest and then at his revolvers, smirking as he suggested that Patton was a performer who liked to act brave for the newsreels, while Zhukov practiced real bravery in the frozen blood of Stalingrad. The American officers at the table froze. Patton's chief of staff, Cody Gay, later recalled that he felt the temperature in the room drop 20 degrees in an instant. Everyone expected Patton to lose his temper, to flip the table, or to start a brawl that would trigger a global diplomatic crisis. But Patton did something far more terrifying. He stood up slowly, with a mechanical precision that silenced even the breathing in the room. He didn't say a word as he walked around the long table. He stopped just inches from Zhukov's face. Two apex predators, staring into each other's souls. Patton leaned in, his eyes cold and sharp as a bayonet. He smiled, that famous, dangerous smile that made his own soldiers tremble. He whispered, with a calm that made the translator's voice shake. "I consider you a son of a bitch too, but I am a professional son of a bitch. Now let's drink to that." The silence that followed was deafening. It lasted for what felt like an eternity. The Soviet officers shifted, their faces turning a dark shade of red, their hands hovering near their sidearms. The American translator was so pale, he looked like he might faint on the spot. Zhukov didn't move a muscle. He searched Patton's eyes for fear, for hesitation, for a sign of weakness. He found absolutely nothing. For the first time in the entire war, the Iron Marshal of the Soviet Union had met a man who wasn't just his equal in rank, but his equal in sheer, unadulterated ruthlessness. Zhukov eventually broke the tension with a loud, hollow laugh and drained his glass, but the damage was permanent. The Soviet government never forgot that insult. Within 48 hours, a formal complaint was sitting on General Eisenhower's desk. Washington was terrified of losing the fragile peace, and they decided that Patton had to be silenced. By October 1945, the man who had outmaneuvered Rommel and broken the back of the Ardennes offensive was stripped of his beloved Third Army. He was reassigned to the 15th Army, a unit that only existed on paper to record military history. It was a professional execution. But Patton wasn't finished. He began keeping a detailed journal, promising his friends that when he returned to America, he would take the skin off the politicians who had betrayed the free world. He had proof of Soviet crimes and evidence of a massive cover-up by Allied command. He never made it to that press conference. On December 9, 1945, Patton was in his car on a clear, straight road in Germany. A massive 2.5-ton army truck, which had no reason to be in that sector, suddenly made a sharp turn and slammed into Patton's vehicle. The driver of the truck, Robert Thompson, was never court-martialed. He wasn't even given a ticket. He simply vanished. While everyone else in the car walked away with minor bruises, Patton's neck was broken. He spent 12 days in the hospital, showing remarkable signs of recovery. He was scheduled to fly home on December 21st. That morning, he mysteriously died of a pulmonary embolism. His medical records from that day disappeared. The hospital logs went missing. Zhukov outlived Patton by decades, but he never mentioned that night in Bavaria in his memoirs, and Zhukov was a man who forgot nothing. Patton was the only man who saw the truth through the lies of 1945. He was the only one brave enough to call the enemy by its real name. Was it an accident? Or was George Patton removed because he was the only general in the world who could stop the coming Iron Curtain?
Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. This was Mike. Stay sharp.